I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Cynthia Simmons from the Geography Department. You'll see I brought Bertha Becker's books to talk about how great geographers are. Geographers have a really broad interdisciplinary perspective, and you saw from the readings that she's covered a lot of ground in her work. Cynthia is a relatively new hire here. I just learned it's her 5th year, which
going in my 5th year, I can't believe.
My mind. But she has many, many years of experience working in the Amazon before she came to Florida with her husband, Robert Walker, and they've done a lot of the work together. So we are going to hear from Cynthia about some of these really big issues we've already kind of put on the table from the readings and from comments, and from our looking at Amazon development history. She's worked primarily in the same region where I worked my first part of my work in the Amazon that I'll talk about next week. So it's a really nice sequence. They have the same very conflicted region of focus. So I'm going to let you finish introducing yourself and let you edit.
Okay, so before coming to UF, I was at Michigan State University, professor there in geography. And I do work within what geographers refer to as nature society studies, trying to understand how humans impact their environment and how their environment in turn impacts in that multiple interaction. So I've been working in the Amazon, is going on, which also kind of surprised me, 22 years. I'm also an affiliate faculty at the Federal University of Pará in geography, as well as in the Center for the Environment. I've done a number of different projects. These papers I'm going to talk about today really are a culmination of decades of research and different papers that have used different data and resources, and you can refer to some of those other papers and I can talk to you about them. Actually, we put together our group, our lab, I guess you could call it, some of our key papers on the Amazon. And these are key geographic pieces. And although they are broad, they're actually very detailed and very specific. And we use multiple different methodologies. And so just to give you a sense of some of the different work that we do, and if you're interested, we brought some copies here. If anyone else wants them and there aren't any, we can send them to you. So geography and spatial science. We bring together both the interest in space and place and scales, and we use a variety of different methodologies to help us understand geographical phenomenon. I have to admit, I really didn't start out as a geographer. I was a human rights activist. And I was sent down to Panama to investigate all those who died and disappeared in the US invasion of Panama. So I was there in a very different capacity than the work that I'm doing today. And what brought me here, the different doors that open and different doors shut, and life kind of takes you in different directions. I would never have thought, 25 years ago, that I would be doing the work that I'm doing, although I'm not too surprised. There was a political event in 90, referred to as Black Monday, when the first Bush went down. There was big riots, and a number of troops were killed on a highway, and it created a real political stir. And I was working for La Comisión de Justicia y Paz, which is the Commission for Justice and Peace, and it was part of the Archbishop of Panama. So I wasn't affiliated with anyone from the US. And I'm just, a lonely little master's student. I put the articles in the main office, and I really didn't know what was happening. I wasn't really a player. But my commission that I worked for got all mixed up in this crazy issues, and the women, the wives of the men who were accused of attacking the troops, they came to the commission for help, and they saw me and got really upset. So then the Southern Command followed the women who were going to the commission for help, and they saw me and got very upset as well. So it was kind of startling what I was in a strange position. And so the Archbishop, who was basically head of this commission, decided I had to go. I had to get out of town. So they sent me down to the Darien. So I'm all the way down to the Darien in this forested environment. I was interested in human rights, and all of a sudden I saw all these issues in terms of how people live, how the indigenous communities live, how the peasant farmers were living, the large ranchers coming in, the logs being pulled out. I'm reading the scholarship trying to understand what is this. I never was an environmentalist. I'm not sure I am an environmentalist still. I've always been more concerned about human rights, but it put me in the middle of this dynamic. How do you balance development and environment? How do you are they connected? I've always seen them as connected. And so my interest in land conflict, that's how it started, looking at development, both malnutrition and land conflict, in a very important part of the world, environmentally, one of great concern to the international community, the Amazon rainforest. And so trying to understand not just the conflict, but how that conflict is linked to the deforestation. So my goal was always you need to deal with the inequalities, you need to deal with these injustices if you ever want to prevent environmental degradation. But my goal was always the first, not the environmental. So that kind of set me on a journey of my work. And then going into geography, I realized, wow, I guess I am a geographer. And then, of course, I get the question, what is geography? That's always the most difficult. I actually had this morning my seminar in Geographical with all the new geographers for 3 hours talking about what's geography. So I'm not sure if, but I'm going to talk a little bit about my framework to help you understand my thinking. We have a group, and this group has been growing over years, both in terms of our colleagues in Brazil who we work with, as well as our students who have graduated who now are professors at University of Texas or Kansas State and a few other Indiana State. And we're working together to try to gauge these important geographical problems and try to understand what's really happening in these regions in order to inform policy. And so I'm going to talk just briefly about our mission, some of our theoretical foundations, the geographical frame, especially the one that I use, because I actually see the world in terms of geography now. I didn't realize that before. And some of the methodologies we employ, and then trying to highlight that through 2 of the 3 papers you were assigned. I'm not going to go into a great deal about the actual research involved, just try to bring up some key points to gauge discussions or questions you may have. And I can talk about any of the other papers. I think they're in here, so there's a number of them going back from 2002 all the way through to more recently the one that's coming out that you have in your readings. It's coming out in January. Actually, maybe online any day now. So, as I said, our mission is to look at important geographical problems. And one thing, it's called Amazonia, changing Amazonia. Really, it's the changing part that is really of importance. But what we've discovered is that there's similar processes happening right here at home. Coming from Michigan, coming back, I actually grew up in South Florida, and I was an environmental planner, well, not a development planner. Environmental planning was a big issue when I left in the late 90s, and I thought we had everything under control in the US, that we had really great growth management planning. We had really good, national parks and state parks that worked and functioned. And I left Florida and I saw a lot. There was a great deal of nature and areas you could go that were pretty pristine, relatively, and there were areas that were off limits. You couldn't just clear wetlands. You just can't move further into the Everglades. Coming back 16, 17 years later, I'm just amazed at the change that's happened. So I go down to South Florida where I grew up and I don't recognize the place. There's every iota of land is developed, and there's roads, and there's no green space. Where I used to live is in the middle of highways. They're just like kind of circling. So in 16 years, it just completely transformed. We went from, it was like 10 million people in 2000, and by 2016, it doubled 20 million people. And it keeps growing, it's growing. And then I find out that the governor decided to get rid of growth management. And all those wonderful environmental planning policies and laws were quickly, at the stroke of a pen, changed. Our state parks have to support themselves. They need to, nature must pay is the new strategy of the person in charge of the Department of Environment in Florida as well as in other states. So, and they're not paying, because people aren't paying their entrance fees. And there's real issues. I am surprised, but then coming here, realizing, I mean, I grew up in Florida. I moved to Michigan. I didn't have the same sense in Michigan only because I didn't grow up there. And you probably, you know, going back to West Virginia, or you go back, all of a sudden you see a change that's happened. It's pretty dramatic. You know, coming here, it's just, it's a different world. And I know my colleagues in the Amazon love Miami. I mean, they all want to come visit me now that I'm at UF. You know, so they're all coming to Disney, and the roads function and everything works well. But at what cost? I guess if you didn't see it before, you wouldn't know how things have changed. So looking at sustainability here in Florida as well as in the Amazon, I started realizing there are so many similar processes, all the way down to the actors involved in the same type of dynamic. It used to be easy in development to have the North and the South divide. So there's big bad capitalists from the North that are going down to the South and are destroying the environment. So now actually we have in North Florida a real problem with our springs, real problem with our access to water. And it turns out that JBS, who bought out the largest meat producer from Brazil, most of you know about Brazilian politics, it's been a big issue. They bought out the family Pilgrim's Pride and Swift Farms, Swift Meats. So they actually own most of the meat packing and meat producing, as well as grain producing companies in the US as well as in Florida. And they're the ones who are contracting, quote unquote, family farms to produce eggs and chicken. But the land is actually in the name of, you know, Uncle Millie's or Uncle Paul's, you know, farm. They'll have like little signs. If you drive out towards the Swanee River Valley, you go down the road, you start seeing all these cute little signs for all these little farms. Then underneath there's a smaller sign that says Pilgrim's Pride. And then if you take Pilgrim's Pride and you connect it to its JBS. And there are issues in terms of the political collusion, in terms of selling out, politicians selling out because they get kickbacks from reducing the how pollution is controlled and managed. And there's these interesting dynamics that I didn't realize were so interconnected. Coming back here all of a sudden, it's really quite fascinating. It's the same issues we're concerned about in the Amazon, especially my colleagues in geography look at, are the same issues we see happening here as well. And that's one of the things I try to talk about. I have always been focused on place and localities, and you have these large silver bullet plans for development or conservation, and inevitably they fail. They don't work the way they're planned, the way they're expected to, because there is a uniqueness and a difference that the place makes, and the outcomes vary. And so there is a great deal of complexity. No two farmers, large farmer, small farmer, indigenous person is exactly alike. There's a great deal of heterogeneity, and how they organize themselves can vary. However, I'm amazed the more I've done my research and the more small farmers I've spoke to and you know, did massive surveys. We had one of our projects looking at new agrarian reform settlements in the Amazon. We went to 750 households in 26 settlements, and with this big extensive assessment of what are their agricultural activities and what are they doing. There's actually a great deal of similarity across. So there is heterogeneity at the same time. You do have some homogeneity in certain respects, and the same thing in terms of complexity. There are some of the same processes at work in the Amazon in one place that you may see happening in another place, and the same thing, we're seeing some of the same processes playing out here in Florida. And I guess my concern, kind of my motivation is we need to recognize there is diversity and heterogeneity. We need to see the big picture, what's happening, and how there's a great deal of similarities if we're going to, you know, plan for the future or deal with some of these different issues. So as I said, there's also this global connectedness. You have a global economic system, you know, global cattle and, you know, linkages across the food systems, and they are all connected. Florida land rents are really low. There was a lot of empty land. It is the prime place for agricultural investments. So you have Canadians coming in, and you have Brazilians coming in, you have all these international investors to invest in agriculture because it's cheap land. Same as the frontier mentality of the Amazon forest. And there's issues that can be paralleled. And so in our group, We've expanded, and then we have one student who's working, my student specifically working on looking at that connection between Brazil, especially JBS, and what's happening here in Florida. I have another student who's just come in who's from India, who's looking at some of the similar processes in India. So we want to like try to make comparisons. And all the work that I do in Brazil, I'm not picking on Brazil, because we're doing it too, and it's not worse. Like, I actually think that we're just not seeing what's happening in our own backyard. We're so busy looking elsewhere. But if we start looking, we can find those similarities. So we do approach geography as a spatial science. Really, our use of theory is very eclectic. I personally borrow from other disciplines and other theories based on what is the views of why something is happening, where it's happening, in order to study it, to analyze it. Some of the work can be very positivist and model-oriented. And then again, we have some that's very much based on critical social theory, construction, deconstruction with the discipline and development paper. So we definitely have a very kind of eclectic theoretical foundations. And I guess you could say it works. Yes, we're not opposed to, you need to be critical of the methods and the models you're using and how you're seeing things regardless of which side you're coming from. I don't want to talk too much about the theoretical foundations, although that's this paper getting into Foucault and these various topics. We want to talk about those we can, but I didn't really focus as much on that here because this was very much speaking to a geography audience. The Annals Association of American Geographers is the flagship journal of the discipline, and so it's you have to have strong geographic theories in order to place an article, especially in the Nature Society section. But if you have questions about it, we can definitely go there. We do focus on place, whether it's looking at the Brazil nut forest as a place or looking at the Tapajós River as a place and trying to understand why do we see that outcome in that particular place. And looking at those various connections. This is my conceptual design, and it does, I think, this is how I see the world. So here is the problem, the geographic problem. And some disciplines and some researchers go in and they say, okay, there's deforestation. What's happening in that place that causes deforestation? Or there's land conflict. What is it in that place that's causing the land, the conflict? But there are other factors and forces that influence what's happening in that particular place. There is no place in isolation of other places, especially today. Everything is interconnected in very surprising ways. And so coming into to understand a problem, I come with this frame trying to understand the bigger picture of what is happening in this particular region. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the development history since you've covered it, and there's other papers you can draw on. But really to understand, and when I've looked at what's happening here, I explicitly try to make a correlation, and we do actually statistically now make a correlation. We have another paper coming out hopefully soon where we actually can statistically show that land conflict, in fact, is a driver of deforestation. And we've actually identified potential actors more responsible than others, but I won't say that because there's some Brazilian lawyers here. And no, my colleagues are more. Anyway, it's a really hot topic in the Amazon. Who's responsible for the deforestation? Is it the large fazendas, or is it the landless movement to come in and invade? At what point does the deforestation occur, and who are the actors involved? So, yeah, that's another paper. So, but you can see over time, this place is not in isolation. You have the global scale, and this is hierarchical, but I've tried to make it flat, and it's just really difficult. So I'm not meaning for this to be hierarchical. Everything is connected and interconnected, and they're actually the same size, just different colors. But in order to understand what's happening here, you have to understand what were the pressures, what were the influences that motivated, that influenced what is happening on at the local level. So you have, of course, economic development, whether it be focused on livestock or mining, growing environmental concern, growing concerns for indigenous rights. So you see it shifting over time and across scale. That influenced where investments went, whether it is coming from governments, international investments in development, whether they invested in agro-industry through the government, federal government. And this is looking at Brazilian Amazon, but this is the pattern we see elsewhere. Or the concern with land reform that we see occurring as the government shifted from the military regime to the democratic reform, as well as creation of conservation areas. There's lots of interest in creating conservation areas at the national level, influenced by as well people within the countries, as well as people from outside their investments. This influences what actually happens on a region scale. There are others who are involved, whether it's economic reserves. In this case, the Brazil Nut reserves holdings, opening up roads and that attracted spontaneous colonization, brought people in at the region scale. Creation of conservation areas as well as indigenous reserves took land away from those people competing for land, coming in. At the local level, I've argued is there's resource scarcity, there's competition for those resources, which then in turn leads to conflict. This conflict, whether it's individuals fighting for land or it's organized and social movements that are leading these efforts. So there's something in this dynamic that's leading to the conflict, and it just happens to be that the conflict happens to correlate with the deforestation. Is there a connection? And why this is important is if you don't see the bigger picture, then when you're trying to resolve this as a problem, if you're looking at it as the policy implications, what should be done, you may be missing the point. It may not be more reserves, it may be dealing with land inequalities, it may be some other factors. So really trying to look at a place, and this could be any place, and trying to understand how it fits within the broader global economy, how it fits within the dynamics that are unfolding in particular regions, in particular places. And another key is that this is dynamic, it changes. So you think you know what was happening back in the 1970s to 80s, it's not the same thing that's happening in the 1990s, and in 2000 we have a whole new ball game. But if you don't look at it as a dynamic process, you may also be missing the point. And that's what we're trying to get at with this particular paper, is trying to move forward the contested frontier, bringing it up to date with some of the dynamics that are unfolding today, and the transformation of those actors. They're not the same actors that were originally attracted to the region, whether they be forest dwellers who now become cattle ranchers, whether small scale or large scale, or they're Brazil nut oligarchs who now have also become the cattle ranchers, and it's changing with new infrastructure projects, new access to resources. So this is kind of just like a framework to try to understand what's happening in this region. So there's a variety of different methodologies and different data we collect to study this. We have an idea what we think is happening and how everything pieces together, and then we collect household surveys and data, and we do ethnographic research, do large-scale interviews, key informative interviews, to try to collect the data in order to analyze, also using remotely sensed imagery to see how the changes happen. So this is the frame that we use, kind of, especially me. That's how I see the world. But it's not everyone's. I mean, I know not many people come in and then say, okay, deforestation was cattle ranching. Well, it could be. But why is it cattle ranching? So maybe something else, or without thinking about the implications. So the local is important, but the local in isolation is inefficient. It's not insufficient, I should say. So we use a fusionist methodology, although theory is important. That's another important issue is there's been so much work done on the Amazon, as you all know, Marianne knows. We're not recreating something that someone else has already done. There's been much work done looking at the drivers of deforestation. The question is, are those drivers still the drivers, or have things changed? We don't need to recreate and try to find new drivers. We also try to triangulate evidence, like I said, using ethnographic surveys, key informative interviews, participant observation, collection of secondary sources, combining it with remote sensing, really with the goal to have the most solid evidence to back up the claims we make. You know, I can go in, you go there and have do an interview with a sample of 2 or 3, and you come out with a finding. How valid is that finding? And much of what we want to understand is how the land change has happened, that the remote sensing allows us to do it. We can actually see on the ground how land change has occurred, and then try to triangulate with that, with who was there, what was happening on the land, and how it was transformed. And that's some of what we've been doing. We mix quantitative, qualitative analysis, from spatial regressions to interdisciplinary modeling with interdisciplinary teams. Our work is like I said, with quite a bit of work that we've done. This has some of the main pieces, just some examples. So if you're interested in what we do, it's not always really fast, simple reading. Sometimes there's a lot of theory involved, and a detailed background. As geographers, we like to, the context is important. Today I want to focus on 2, because the third one really took me off topic. I was just trying to figure out how do I fit all 3 papers into a coherent flow. Even these 2 alone are somewhat challenging, since really this work, especially the first paper, is based on decades of research and many different projects and evidence we've pulled from many different projects. And it's collaborative, so there's a number of us who are working together. And so I present this analysis, this assessment, but it doesn't really go into detail about the data collection methods and how many houses we visited, because that was data we were able to use in this article. But there are other articles that actually go through all the details of the exact specifics for project. So, and I can talk and speak to it. So, like I said, this is the culmination of decades of research. We've been funded by the National Science Foundation from CNBQ, which is the Brazilian version of the National Science Foundation. Our graduate students through Inter-American Foundation funding, Latin American Economic Commission funding, to analyze really the issue between land conflict, agrarian reform, and deforestation. So we have a program of research that's evolved to trying to understand these connections, and various studies that have been conducted, and each piece provides a piece to that puzzle that gets us to both this paper, which is the culmination of kind of the main theories and concepts, to the other paper that we hope gets published soon, where we actually analyze it statistically based on what we call contentious land change. There is a 2012 Annals article called Contentious Land Change. This paper we've done now, though, actually looks at it with a longitudinal study, so it's got much more data.
Yeah, that was on there recommended.
Right. I think it's in here, though, if you're interested. So the 2 main projects that where most of the data is coming from, one is the direct action land reform. That is discussed in the Amazon Land Wars paper in greater detail. We also have a world development paper that goes through a great deal of detail. What we're trying to understand are, what are the processes of agrarian reform movements? So not the colonization that's been the focus of much work in the Amazon, but what came after colonization ended. All these new settlements that have been created, sometimes spontaneously and other times through various social movements, not just the MST, but the movement of rural landless workers, other movements as well. So how do they organize themselves? What is the agency of the participants? How do they use their space? How does it impact their overall development outcomes, as well as their environmental outcomes? And so this study was, like I said, was quite extensive. We went to 26 settlements, both in Pará as well as in Rondônia. Half of the settlements were spontaneous, where there was no obvious leaders. People just arrived, kind of that spontaneous colonization that Hibeji writes about. But then they organized afterwards, and then they petitioned the government for the rights as an agrarian reform settlement. The others were organized by a movement. They did an occupation. They organized themselves, sometimes over months, to organize, to choose what property they're going to occupy and invade, then they occupy. And there are a number of movements that use this strategy, not just the MST. Because according to the Brazilian Constitution, and the lawyers I'm sure could probably go through and identify, in the Amazon land wars I talk a little bit more about that, but they identify lands that they think are not productive, that aren't meeting their social function, or that are breaking some environmental law. And then they occupy and or invade, depends on what side you want to call it. But there is a big debate, and it's an issue I know that my colleagues at UFBA are very interested in, because deforestation is happening on this type of a settlement. Who's responsible? Because you have hundreds of families that get together overnight, they occupy a piece of land. The large owner may or may not lose their rights, get forced to leave. Then it goes to court. They may decide afterwards that, oh, actually, we need to reintegrate that property and kick off the landless. And then the landless regroup and they occupy again. And so you have the 26-year period this could be unfolding, which is our study period. And you don't have this one land manager. And most of the work done to understand land change is looking at the land manager who makes agronomic decisions based on prices, based on. But in fact, if it keeps shifting hands from, they have different motivations. Whether it's a large landowner who knows he's going to lose his property, may decide, you know what, I'm going to liquidate that the trees so I can get the capital before I lose it. You may have the same thing. The landless come and they occupy, and they need to prove productivity before they get investigated, or INCRA comes in and does their study, and they may clear the forest. And so there is a real question over that 26-year period that they're from the very first occupation through to the final outcome, whether it's a settlement or not. Deforestation happens. In our particular study region, went down from, I'll talk a little bit about that too. That's one of the things we're looking at with this paper. But it went from almost 90-something% in the 1970s down to less than 8% within a 30-year period of time. So who's responsible for the deforestation? I know that's a big debate. We actually have collected a lot of data on this, but this is trying to understand the household dynamics in these settlements and how they use the land and their various strategies. We then received another grant from NSF to then study, so we looked at land conflict and land agrarian reform. How does that impact the environment? So we had enough suspicions that it did, enough evidence to show that we think it did, that we got this funding. Tropical deforestation is still an issue, even though there was a period where we thought that deforestation was completely declining. Well, we see it rises again. There may be trends where it's declining, but that doesn't mean it's a law that's going to continue to decline. So we still have to worry about tropical deforestation. I would say we definitely have to worry about tropical deforestation. Initially, when we had this first version of the discipline development paper was being reviewed by reviewers, one of the reviewers came back and said, it's not a problem anymore. Deforestation is on the decline. And it was like, for now, we'll see. The same, and that's not just Brazil. I looked at the US. I think we're heading for some problems in the future. There's also issue with land conflict, not just in Brazil, but around the world. So whether you're, Zimbabwe conflicts, issues happening, in Venezuela with land conflicts, you're having it across the board. So land conflict and this demand of the landless and the powerless to have land, and then the concern about deforestation, these are big problems. Are they necessarily linked? Do policymakers consider them together? And so what we were trying to understand with this research is trying to actually statistically show, and through our research empirically show that there's a connection between this type of dynamic conflict and contest for land and the deforestation that results. And this is, we focus on the same study region, and it started out with one of our students who did this for his dissertation research. He's now our colleague who's on the project. We've been working together for many years now. But going to the Brazil Nut Polygon in the south of Pará, it's an area that was created in the 1980s. It was designated as land for the Brazil nuts and for extraction of the Brazil nuts. And I'll get into more of the conflict dynamic, but they actually created a map, and you can see each of the properties in the Brazil Nut Polygon. And we actually have that that layer. One of my colleagues at Sudam at the time gave us it. We digitized it. We've been analyzing and looking at this. These properties that are red have been occupied. So there was, in fact, an occupation. So there was this conflict, what we call direct action land reform, that goes on for many years occurring. So this is an area that's been under contestation. Since we know where there has been land conflict, we know which ones have been transformed into agrarian reform settlements. Because in the end, if the government decides that this land is not productive and they expropriate it, it then gets given or redesignated for agrarian reform and settled. And so we were trying to understand, was more deforestation happening on these properties than they are on these properties that have never had conflict? Yes.
My question is, are these private lands or?
That's a complicated story. They were, in fact, public at one point, and then over 100 years ago, the state came up with the land leases that they gave to private interests. So they're a foramento is the type of a holding, and so they were, in fact, land leases. People didn't own the land. Oligarchs didn't own the land, but they had rights to use the land. And until they did have rights to the land, so how they actually went from being, having the rights to the land as a foramento for the Castagna extraction to actually being the landowners, there is a great debate about how that actually took place. And that's another thing we were kind of looking at, but.
Could I just make a comment
Yes.
too? In this region, which is the region where I worked as well, these areas were relatively less deforested because they were being used for Brazil nut extraction. Right. So all around it, you had a lot of deforestation for cattle ranches. So then they became sort of the target because they had been maintained in forest.
Right, and that's why we chose this particular place, because there was a lot of forest. And we could actually, at the property level, we could analyze deforestation for 26 years. We collected remote sense images for annual period for 26 years and looked at change in deforestation. So we can actually pinpoint when the deforestation happened. So that was one thing, a set of data. We also, I'm not sure what's up there, my colleague at the time when he was a student went down to Marabá, and they have these, this archive full of journal articles. And so he went through the main newspapers in the region for that same 26-year period, and he extracted every single article on every single land conflict that showed up. So we now have over 8,000 in our newspaper archive, which we could actually correspond to the property level, because I would say the owner, we know who the owner is, we know when they got it, we know the fazenda name, so we can actually correlate land conflict on the ground with the deforestation as it's happening, playing out. And when the land was occupied, when it was owned by the landowner, when they were dispossessed. I mean, it becomes much more complicated. I don't want to go into too great a detail. That's the focus of the contentious land change paper. But we have a great deal of information, needless to say, on this process and how it unfolded. So yeah, over 8,000, 2 newspapers, 27 remote sense images, which actually combined to 56 Landsat images. We then did a spatial regression analysis, and we identified outliers. Which properties did not meet our expectations in terms of the causes of deforestation? Which had more deforestation than we expected? Which ones had less deforestation than we expected? And then we also sampled those that met our expectations, and we went and did interviews. And we did mapping, and we were able to, where did they begin clearing the land, trying to confirm, have more preponderance of evidence of how the transformation actually took place at the lot level. So we interviewed ranchers and social movement leaders and members and government agents. So this is part of the data we're using, understanding evidence we're using in the discipline and development paper. And we know, like I said, so we know who the owners are. So we know actually in the Polygonosis castagnais, there were only two properties that were outside capital. All the rest were in fact Brazil nut families. So the original owner, the original leaseholder of the land becomes the property holder. So the cattle ranching in this region wasn't because of external capital, per se. There wasn't some outsider coming in. It was a transformation of those actors themselves. So it's one thing we're trying to point out. And it's because we have all this data and this information, and we also went to all the cartorios, the
Land
registries.
registries.
We actually went back and redid their titles and their history as well. So we have pretty good evidence and information on this. So this paper, Discipline and Develop, is a story about the Brazil nut forest. And the Brazil nut forest is this magnificent region that had an unusual cluster of Brazil nut trees. Brazil nut trees are beautiful, magnificent. They basically were the source of an important extractive economy. When the rest of Amazonia was dealing with the rubber bust, this region in Marabá and the surrounding areas, they had no problems at all because they produced the Brazil nuts to the world. And those Brazil nut trees were there for a while. And our question is, what happened? How did it go from being this, and this picture, I have to say, and I wanted to talk to you about that if you have any older pictures of the actual, this is in the Carajás Reserve. You go to the region, and there really is no forest left. It's almost completely gone. We even went as far as hiking across properties. We were like on a quest. We're going to find the Brazil nut forest on these big properties because we thought they were back. It was really, we haven't been that lucky. So from 1970, you had, in the early 70s, you had about 97% of this area was completely forested. Until today, there's really, it's more like 8%, it was 10% from when we had our image cover. So it declined dramatically. And this is important, and the Brazilians here will probably realize it's important, but many other scholars and researchers and students from other parts of the world wouldn't. Brazil is huge, and the Brazilian Amazon is huge, and our study region is huge. So yes, our study region is the Brazil Nut Polygon. The Brazil Nut Polygon is over 7,000 square kilometers. The Brazil Nut Forest is over 20,000 square kilometers. And so it's a huge area. So it's, half, what do they say, they put together Delaware and a few other states, and that's the size. This is a big area. And if you were to look at the deforestation that happened from the very beginning, the 1970s, up to 2010, 17% of all deforestation of Brazilian Amazon happened in the study site. So on our actual properties. So it's significant. So I always have to point this out to my colleagues who don't know the Amazon. They say, it's just a study. So what does this mean? It's just a study region. Well, this is a huge study region. Okay. So we're trying to understand, well, why did this happen? How did this occur? And are there lessons we can learn from this? Are there things we could be thinking about? I mean, if one of the most important extractive economies are completely destroyed in a 30-year period, who's to say that the rest of the extractive economy is not going to be destroyed as well? There's other places where you have Brazil nuts, but they're getting pushed further and further out to the fringes of the forest frontier. With the new roads, with the new waterways, they're all going to be accessible. So what does the future hold? And is it just to promote extractive reserves sufficient without considering the threats that are imminent or not? Okay, so there's been a lot of work done on land conflict, on land reform, the notion of the contested frontier. Of course, Mary Ann's going to be talking about that next week. She's basically was my, the seminal work, and I kind of built off what she had done when I was a student. I recall reading Contested Frontiers and just being, that's what's happening, I know it. And so it was kind of my motivation to start looking at how these are all coming together. So there has been work looking at the structural factors to try to explain the unequal distribution of income. Of course, there's issues. Many would argue that Brazil has the most inequitable land distribution, a lot of inequalities. There's been work that's identified who are the actors in this conflict. It's oftentimes portrayed as it's a conflict between small peasant farmers and these large ranchers. But there's more at work, and the actors aren't fixed. they're dynamic, and they change over time. So it may have been initially, but how did it evolve and unfold, and who are the actors today, and what is it that they do? There has also been studies looking at the different triggers of land conflict and violence, rising inaccessible land tenure or unequal tenure institutions, rising land rents is what triggers. So there's been a number of studies. And there's also been work that really details the different social movements and how they organize themselves. And so our work builds on that, and we try to move it forward. And we're also trying to understand, really, is land conflict. So we have a political economy work that really, the figures that I showed, of the global, local, regional, what are the forces at work? Those same forces that cause land conflict and violence also are the same forces that cause deforestation. And so there's been quite a bit of work, actually a large body of literature on land change science that identified the various drivers. So infrastructure, roads are built, and as roads are built, people have access, and we see deforestation. These are the more distal factors that cause. You have logging, the loggers follow the road, they go in and they deforest. Those are more proximate causes of deforestation. Small farmers, when you actually look, and you were to aggregate all the deforestation that occurs, most of the, according to most of them, I think, uniformly say that if you were to, it's more deforestation that smallholders do than the large ranchers. So just the large ranchers, there's fewer of them that are causing the damage, whereas the smallholders are lots of them. Pasture, of course, maybe the smallholders are turning to ranching, and they're in fact involved in pasture formation. In fact, that's been part of our study, looking at even the smallholders who are in the agrarian reform settlements, who are supposed to be more interested in food sovereignty and producing food for consumption. They're also engaged in cattle, the cattle production chain. And many of them, in fact, are selling their calves to the large ranchers, who then sell them to the slaughterhouses. In our study region, there's, 15 new slaughterhouses. JBS has 4 or 5 major industrial slaughterhouses. And there is this kind of leakage versus the laundering. You have they're certified that the cattle comes from the large ranch, when in fact it doesn't, that the smallholders sell it to the middlemen, and the middlemen sell it to the ranchers, and then the ranchers in turn bring it to the slaughterhouse. So that's part of another study that's we've looked at, that is out in land. I think that may be here as well. So it's much more complicated. Our expectations going into the field, based on the scholarship we read, didn't necessarily hold what we were actually seeing on the ground level. And this is where I think when people don't have that, they only look at a local, they only look at the fazenda, the ranch. They don't realize that there's more connections there. And what we argue is there's another dimension that's not considered, another driver of deforestation, and that's what we call contentious land change. This process of contestation over land ownership, the occupation of the land, the large landowner maybe has a militia, maybe has, there's land use managers who come in to defend the land. Then you may have a judicial process where they get kicked off the land, and then the landowner comes and he takes charge again. And so there's this, who is the actual land manager during that period of conflict and contestation? And so we are looking at it in terms of not one land manager. And all of these land change science, really, when they're talking about logging, when they talk about ranchers, they're looking at a land manager who makes its decisions based on agronomic purposes or economic purposes, prices. But in fact, what happens when you have one unit of land that has many owners, and they keep shifting and changing what motivates them to clear the land? So that's what we were trying to bring up. And what we argue is there's a new repertoire, there's a new series of actors that would be considered. There's in some geographers and those who use remote sensing may focus on the pattern. So now we have remote sensing, we can look at the patterns on the ground, and we can tell you what the land use is. Most of the climate models use a global land change system, but that land change and land use is completely different. So yes, you know how much vegetation, but you don't know how people are actually using that land, or what is motivating their decisions to clear the land or not. One good example is I had, when I was working at Michigan State University, I worked with Dr. David Skoll, sort of. He was part of the Global Change Center, had the initial contract with NASA for all of the satellite images. They get referred to as terrific. And he's an avid, advocate for remote sensing. And he swore that, if he can see the pattern, he can tell you the process. And there was this issue about secondary regrowth in the 2000s, that there's all this secondary regrowth in the Amazon. And they're like, oh yeah, see, it's not a problem. If the forest is going to come back, we shouldn't worry about how it's being managed because it's regrowth. But those who work on the ground, who actually go in and talk to the farmers, they say, yeah, that's not regrowth, that's dirty pasture. And we're planning on clearing it once we have the income and resources to do so. So that's the land use. The land covers just the vegetation. So looking at trying to predict climate change, if you just look at the pattern, and then they say, okay, well, business as usual, we would anticipate 25% growth in agriculture. And then they just take the imagery and they just expand out 25%. But what happens when that road gets built? And what happens when that waterway gets built? The population shifts or changed. The patterns are going to be different. So you have to understand the processes in order to understand the pattern. And if you can do so, then you can predict what the pattern may be in the future, whatever. So my big, another motivation is trying to make that clear. People mix it up all the time, but there is a big difference. So you're looking at pattern to process or process to pattern. The best is to know process to pattern, pattern to process. And if you can understand that, you have a better predictive model, and if that's what it is you're trying to do.
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay. So basically, we come down to, in this paper, which is pretty in-depth and detailed in terms of the history of how things unfolded in this particular region. And we look at how, political forces, the role of the state, what the state was doing and what their motivations were throughout this period of time. Who were the actors? What was the role of the large Brazil nut oligarchs? At what point did they shift to become cattle ranchers? Who were the peasant populations? How did they change and transform over time, especially with this new advance of the world economy into the region? So in 2005, the south of Pará was determined to be hoof and mouth disease free, and it was certified for global export. And you could see the cattle just skyrocketed once it was opened up. And with JBS and all the big slaughterhouses, you see this change and shift. There was now this new market, there's this new demand that was growing. It didn't make sense for smallholders to continue to plant, a variety of reasons, but food to consume when in fact they know there's a guaranteed market with the cattle. So what we see is this shift, and even through our interviews with the smallholders, and these were some of them in the social movement. So if you look at MST and their discourse about food sovereignty and this issue of agroecology, in this region, no one was doing agroecology, and unfortunately, it's still a real issue because for a variety of reasons, whether it's the government's not got the right mix of extension, and that's a whole other story. But the fact of the matter is, when we look at the actual actors, they are in fact engaged in the cattle economy. They are now allies with their former foe, which was the large landowners. And even so, the role of the state, I know this notion of seeing like the state, James Scott, that the state has this vision and they put in place order in order to bring about development. So there is a form of disciplining. So yes, they creating roads, shifting around the power structure through devolution of municipal government. Although the actors involved were the same oligarchs, the power centers really didn't shift. But there was another motivation, and the fear of insurrection, the fear of revolution in this region. The region was chosen by the Brazil's Communist Party to be a site for a revolution. And there's about 60, 69 student activists and others who went to the region to try to organize the peasantry. And there weren't many, but they did have some allies. But the government took it seriously. 10,000 plus troops were organized and mobilized to kill 69 people. It was a major effort. There's a lot written in Portuguese, and many of them are coming from former colonels and former people really involved, who I'm not sure why, but they told their whole story in books. There are a lot of books out there. And in the region, talking to the large, owners, or talking to the various, small farmers today, they all remember what happened, and they all have this fear of what could possibly happen. There is this, in this region, this kind of tension. It was hard to get that published in the annals or because there's, well, it's not like Brazil used a burnt earth policy, torched earth, so how could it really be? It has to be a thing like the state. Well, actually, when you look at, there was plans to build a road long ago. It was the military government came in and they made it happen. And where they built those roads happened to go right through our study region, and it happened to make access 3 points of entry into where those revolutionary insurgents were organized. And they chose that spot because it was so far and distant. So it was hard to get that published. People didn't want to think that really happened. And I think outside of the Amazon, I'm not sure in other parts of Brazil, they weren't as aware, because the state doesn't want people to know what it's doing. So even as Foucault would say, those things happen away because citizenry don't want to see that. But ever since the Truth Commission report was organized in 2014, all of this is now available on a website. You can look at interviews, you can look at documentation. It's pretty remarkable. So now it's acceptable to say that, even though my colleagues in the region have been saying, the only way you can really understand the deforestation here in the complex is to go back to that period and what it triggered. This site, there was a great deal of violence, not just the 69 that Truth Commission recognized that's disappeared. There were many more peasant households that were also, and peasant farmers who were also caught up as they were trying to get rid of the network of help for those revolutionaries that were also disappeared. And according to my colleagues in the region, they've done studies, and for every one that's acknowledged land conflict, some say there's 3 more, others say there were 50 more. So the numbers of what actually happened in that region they argue that it's still not enough. And there are many who want to continue. They are looking for bones in the forest. We have one study site that happens to be right next to the Casa Azul, and it's forested. But it's right close to markets, it's right close to access. And why is that forested? And the people who live, those who occupy next to that property, argue that, well, every time we try to invade, the military comes. So I have colleagues looking into, well, what is on that property that they're trying to protect? That's one issue. The issue is, the discipline and develop, and using the Brazilian flag order in progress. It was one of my Brazilian colleagues that, as we were going through this and trying to understand that, just said, they looked at that, and the slogan, that was the slogan, and then the military used that slogan to, let's create order,
So
to have progress.
we should change that slogan. That should be a mission, actually.
Well, but there is this thing like the state, and there's the issue that these large-scale projects are, they're bound to fail. They never would work. If you go back to the region today, people say, yeah, it worked. It brought progress. There's gated communities, there's shopping malls, there's, it looks like Sao Paulo. It's developed, they've got roads, they've got, the lights work. People actually stop at crosswalks, which is, they really do. I don't know if you walk through Marabá and you're walking, and I'm really hesitant when it comes to walking in Brazil. I didn't like walking in Michigan either, the car's rules, but you can get hit by a car, it happens all the time. In Marabá, there's a crosswalk, no light, you walk out, they all stop. I don't know why, but it works, maybe. So I'm not, passing judgment on that, but it did. People say it did bring progress. So is it seem like the state is the failure because the state is just trying to implement the modernist paradigm of the thinkers at the time? Was there another reason why those roads were important? Why land creation was important? And what were the outcomes? So that brings us to,
Need to wrap up.
okay, let me just go off and I'll stop on real quick. The lessons learned for this next paper. This is a story about the Tapajos. And the Tapajos is absolutely phenomenal. And this is here, I've never been like I said, I'm not an environmentalist. I very much care about people. But I am on a quest with my son to take him to all those places that may not be around much longer. And this is a place we had to take our son. There's actually a video, I won't show it, but it's, you know, you can hear the water flowing. This is down by the Amazon National Park, the Miranchi, right where they're going to put in place, you know, basically get rid of this, you know, bust it, explode, create the various dams and locks in order to generate electricity, but more importantly, in order to create the waterway. And so, are there drivers of change any different than they were in the south of Pará, in the Brazil? What does the future hold? And so this is what this paper talks about, both in terms of looking at the infrastructure development that's planned. Is this just the state seeing like the state, as James Scott would say? Or are they using another form of discipline in order to make these things happen? People in this region, the Munduraku, would say the state is using corporal punishment. I mean, they're sending military troops in, they call it Operation Tapajos, is a whole other, to make them agree to the indigenous plan, to participate. They're refusing to participate. They believe that if they don't participate, then it can't, the projects can't be approved. Is that really going to stop that from happening? And why I venture to say I'm really dubious it will, really is this is coming from another paper that's coming out in Biotropica very soon, with a whole other, you know, and larger group of scholars. And this is the Tapajos region. The rest of this infrastructure project, this is all part of the large infrastructure plan for South America. And I don't know if you can see, if we can step back into the big picture, they're all connected. And the idea is not just a few dams. So if you focus on a dam, you're missing the picture. It's not just one dam, it's not just 3 dams, 5 dams, it's the waterway. Here you have the big picture in this region. And it's hard to see because if you look at the URSA plan, they look like they're kind of all separate and, you know, projects that they wish they could do. Today, however, they at least put some GIS out and they're trying to make it clear what their motivations are really for people in the country so they realize that this is important. But then I was looking at this here, this is the Tapajos, and I was looking at these various dams that have to be built. And the dams, it really is not for the energy, it's for getting rid of those rapids. And if they get rid of the rapids, then they can transport all the goods to the, you know, to the ocean. But they have the dam to stop. I mean, what in the world, why would they create a dam in the middle of nowhere? Well, what you don't see is, I'm not sure how well it's showing up here, is there's a municipal road that connects the port with the main highway system and the railway system. So it's hard to see the big picture of what this means. But it creates this huge corridor. And the idea is, you know, to create the Mississippi of the Amazon. And there's lots of investors coming from all over the world that are investing. And you have national level plans, you've got state level plans. Pará has new railroads it's proposing that are getting approved. There are different ministries, but they really do come together and they really have coordinated their efforts. And it's amazing engineering feat. Because once you put it all together, you realize, wow, that looks just like the US. We got a highway system, we have Mississippi. The economic logic, is it seem like the state of James Scott that's bound to fail? Or is it a matter of time where it may actually come together and you may see a whole new transformed Tapajos? Is it going to be what you expect, what what people want? Maybe. Many of my colleagues love South Florida. I mean, they do. They come here. They think this is wonderful. Maybe it will be the South Florida of, but they are the same similar processes at work. And it's really, there are many interests. So if you just focus on the local, if you just focus on a project in the Tapajos, you're missing the big picture of the threats to come. And what role do the Munduruku play? I mean, do they have a right to stop progress? Those are questions not for me to answer, but it's important if you want to work with the Munduruku that you help them understand what threats are coming their way. If we could see the big picture, maybe we could plan a better way, an alternative. So instead of this dam and that, maybe these others, if you want to work with the Munduruku or those who want to resist, tell them in advance that it's coming. I mean, the big problem with the resistance, you know, the anti-dam movement, is they usually don't know it's happening until it's happening. And yet those plans have been in place for decades. The military government already laid out all these roadways. You know, they already went through and determined where is the best place for hydropower potential. Padang did the Brazilian government did a geological survey. They identified where all the mining is. We have that information, so we can just piece it together. This is what geographers do. This is how I see the world. You know, so yes, I care about the Tapajos and I care about the Munduruku, but I can't see them in isolation. I have to look at the bigger picture of what, both in terms of how they fit within and their rights, as well as what threats are coming their way. So anyway,
Okay.
what's the future?
So this is a